It appeared to be a simple portrait of a mother and her daughters. Yet a closer look revealed something unusual about their hands. Dr. James Mitchell had spent 15 years examining photographic archives at the New York Historical Society, but he had never encountered anything quite like this. The portrait had arrived in a donation box from a Brooklyn estate sale. Inside were dozens of glass plate negatives wrapped in yellowed newspaper dated 1923. Most depicted ordinary late 19th century scene-stern shopkeepers. Wedding groups, children dressed in their Sunday clothes. But one image immediately captured his attention. 3 women gazed out from the past. A mother, likely around 40 years old, sat centered in an ornate wooden chair. Her daughters, who appeared to be in their late teens or early 20s, stood on either side of her. All 3 were African American, dressed in their finest attire, brightly colored dresses with intricate lacework, their hair carefully styled. Behind them was a painted garden backdrop typical of studio photography from that era. What struck James was not the composition or the dignified expressions on their faces. It was their hands. The mother's hands rested in her lap, her fingers interlaced in an unusual arrangement. Her right thumb crossed over her left, with her index and middle fingers extended while the remaining fingers curled inward. Each daughter placed one hand on their mother's shoulders, their fingers arranged in similarly deliberate configurations. James had studied thousands of Victorian-era portraits. Subjects typically held their hands still, folded naturally or resting on props. Photographers of that time demanded absolute stillness because of the long exposure times. Every detail was intentional. These hand positions seemed precise, to purposeful, to be accidental. He lifted a magnifying glass and examined the negative more closely. In the bottom right corner, barely visible, someone had etched tiny numbers into the glass. NY 892247. James couldn't shake the image from his mind. That evening, he returned to his Upper West Side apartment and spread his research materials across the dining table. He had photographed the glass negative with a high-resolution camera, and now the portrait filled his laptop screen in startling clarity. The level of detail was remarkable for an image. From 1892, he could see the texture of the fabric, the small brooch pinned to the mother's collar, even the subtle differences in the daughter's features. But it was the hands that held his attention. He zoomed in until each finger filled the frame. The positioning was unmistakable. This was not random. The mother's right thumb crossed deliberately over her left, a gesture that required conscious effort to maintain during the exposure. Her extended fingers formed a specific shape. The daughter's hands resting on her shoulders mirrored variations of the same pattern. Fingers bent at precise angles, thumbs placed with clear intention. James had studied Civil War photography, Reconstruction-era documentation. In early 20th century social reform movements, he knew that activists and underground networks often used visual signals, specific poses, or objects placed within photographs. Even the way people stood could convey hidden messages to those who knew how to interpret them. He opened his database of abolitionist and post-emancipation activist networks. The Underground Railroad had relied on quilts, songs, and symbols. But this photograph dated to 1892, nearly 30 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and 15 years after Reconstruction ended. What network still required secret codes? His phone buzzed. His colleague, Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in African American history, replied to his earlier message, "Free tomorrow morning." "What did you find?" James typed back. "Something that might rewrite what we know about post-Reconstruction activism in New York. Bring your sources on property rights and documentation. Struggles." Sarah arrived at the Historical Society at 9 sharp, carrying a worn leather satchel filled with research materials. James had the portrait projected onto the wall of the research room, larger than life. The 3 women gazed down at them with quiet dignity. "Look at their hands," James said, pointing with a laser pointer. Every finger was positioned deliberately. Sarah stepped closer to the projection, her eyes narrowing. She set down her bag and pulled out a thick folder. After Reconstruction collapsed in 1877, African American families in the North faced a different kind of battle, not slavery, but systematic exclusion. Property rights, inheritance, and even proof of identity became weapons used against them. She spread documents across the table, legal papers, city records, and newspaper clippings from the 1880s and 1890s. New York was not the progressive haven people imagined. Black families struggled to maintain property ownership, establish businesses, and prove legal marriages. Many had fled the South with nothing but their word: no birth certificates, no marriage licenses, no documentation. James picked up a yellowed newspaper from 1891. The headline read, "Property dispute in Harlem. Family claims ownership without documentation." "Exactly," Sarah continued. "I've been researching mutual aid societies from this period. African American communities created networks to help one another navigate these systems. They pooled resources to hire lawyers, shared information about sympathetic officials, and created their own verification systems when the official ones excluded them." "Secret networks," James said quietly. "Not secret in the sense of hidden," Sarah corrected. "Secret in the sense of parallel operating alongside official systems, using methods that white authorities either didn't notice or didn't understand." James turned back to the portrait. "What if this isn't just a family photograph? What if it's documentation? The etched numbers in the corner in Y1892247 proved to be the breakthrough." After 2 days of searching through city directories and business records, James found a reference. Studio 247 belonged to a photographer named Thomas Wright, who operated from a building on 8th Avenue between 1888 and 1896. The address still existed, though the building had been converted into apartments decades earlier. James stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the brick facade and imagining how it once looked. Wright's studio would have occupied the second floor, with large north-facing windows designed to capture the soft, even light preferred for portraits. Research into Wright himself revealed something unexpected. Thomas Wright was white, born in Massachusetts in 1851, and trained as a photographer in Boston. He moved to New York in 1887 and established his studio, a neighborhood that was becoming increasingly diverse. Home to Irish immigrants, Italian families, and a growing African American community migrating from the South, Wright's clientele was unusual for the era. While most white photographers either refused to photograph black clients or charged them significantly more, odd advertised in African American newspapers, his studio welcomed all customers at equal rates. Sarah uncovered an interview Wright gave to a small progressive newspaper in 1894, in which he described photography as a tool for dignity and documentation, arguing that every person deserved a quality portrait regardless of background. Between the lines, James sensed something more: a quiet form of activism, a deliberate choice to serve a community others excluded. "He was an ally," Sarah said, reading over James's shoulder. "And if these hand positions are codes, he would have been the one who helped create them, document them, and distribute them." James contacted Dr. Marcus Thompson, a cryptography historian at Columbia University who specialized in visual communication systems. Marcus arrived at the Historical Society that afternoon, his curiosity piqued by James's cryptic phone call. "Victorian-era codes often seem impossibly complex to us now," Marcus explained as he examined the portrait. "But they were usually quite practical for the people who used them. The key is understanding the context, who needed to communicate, what information they needed to convey, and who they needed to hide it from." He photographed the hand positions from multiple angles, then opened his laptop and began creating digital tracings. "Let's start with the assumption that each hand position represents something specific, not letters," he said. "Letters would be too complex for a photograph. Categories, confirmations, status size, that's more likely." Sarah pulled out her research on documentation struggles. "What if it's about identity verification?" she asked. These networks needed ways to confirm who people were, that they were legitimate members of the community, and that they could be trusted with sensitive information. Marcus nodded slowly. "That makes sense." The mother's hand position could indicate her role: head of the family, a network member, someone vouching for others. The daughters' positions might reflect their status: documented, undocumented, or seeking assistance. They worked through the afternoon, comparing the portrait with other photographs James had found in the estate sale box. 3 additional images showed similar hand positioning, always subtle and deliberate. In one, a couple's intertwined fingers formed a distinct pattern. In another, a man's hand rested on a Bible with specific fingers extended. "It's not just a single code," Marca said at last. "It's a system, multiple signals that can be combined to convey different meanings." Someone trained these families how to pose. Someone photographed them deliberately, James said. And someone else, other members of the network, knew how to read these images. Sarah made the connection that broke everything open. While researching property rights cases in New York courts from the 1890s, she noticed a pattern. Dozens of African American families had successfully defended property claims, obtained identity documents, or proven legal marriages, often with the same lawyer representing them. His name appeared again and again: Robert Hayes. Hayes maintained an office on West 34th Street. Court records showed that he won an unusually high number of cases for black clients during an era when such victories were rare. More importantly, he frequently submitted photographic evidence, family portraits that documented respectability and proved long-term presence within the community. He was using rights photographs in court, James realized, not just as proof of identity, but as verification of community standing. These families were photographed, their images carefully cataloged, and when documentation was needed, Hayes could present the portraits to judges. But there was more. In Hayes's archived case files at the New York Public Library, Sarah discovered letters, correspondence between Hayes and other activists, teachers, ministers, and business owners discussing verification protocols and community-based documentation systems. One letter, dated March 1893, was particularly revealing. Hayes wrote to a minister in Brooklyn, "We have expanded our photographic documentation to include 73 families. Mr. Wright continues to provide his services at minimal cost. The hand positioning system allows us to encode essential information that can be verified later. Each portrait serves as both dignified representation and practical identification." James leaned back, stunned. They had built an entire parallel documentation system. When official channels failed these families, they created their own and hid it in plain sight, Sarah said to a casual observer. The portraits appeared to be ordinary family photographs. Nothing about them seemed unusual. But 2 members of the network who understood the code, each image contained vital information. With the structure of the network becoming clear, James grew obsessed with identifying the 3 women in the original portrait. The estate sale had come from a brownstone in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, a neighborhood with deep African-American roots. The Historical Society's donor records listed the seller as Patricia Johnson, who had inherited the property from her grandmother. James called Patricia that evening. She was 72 years old, sharp-voiced, and initially skeptical of his interest in old family photographs. But when he described the portrait in detail, her tone changed. "My great-grandmother," she said quietly. "That's Ella Laner. Ella Laner Morrison. The daughters would be my grandmother, Ruth, and her sister Grace. Can you tell me about them?" James asked. Patricia was silent for a moment. "Eleanor was born enslaved in Virginia. She came north after the war with Ruth, who was just a baby. Grace was born here in New York. Eleanor worked as a seamstress. She was known for her skill with lace and fine embroidery. That's how she supported the family." "Did she ever mention being part of any organizations or community groups?" James asked. "She was involved in her church," Patricia said, "and she helped people. That's what my grandmother always said. Eleanor helped families with paperwork, finding housing, connecting with lawyers. She seemed to know everyone, how to navigate every system." James's pulse quickened. "Patricia, I think your great-grandmother was part of something significant. Network that helped African American families document their identities and protect their rights after Reconstruction." Patricia was quiet again. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I always knew she was special, but we lost so much history. After she died in 1919, the family scattered. My grandmother rarely talked about those early years. With Patricia's permission, James and Sarah began tracing Ella Laner Morrison's connections. Church records from Bethel Church in Brooklyn listed Ella Laner as a member from 1879 until her death. She served on the Ladies' Aid Society, which officially provided charity to families in need. But the meeting minutes revealed something more structured. The society kept careful records of the families they assisted, names, ages, circumstances, needs, but certain entries included notations that made no sense at first, numbers and letter codes that seemed arbitrary, until Sarah realized they corresponded to Thomas Wright's numbering system. They were cross-referencing, she explained to James. The church identified families who needed documentation. Wright photographed them using the appropriate hand codes. Hayes used the photographs in legal proceedings, and the church records tracked everything hidden in plain sight within charity work. James found more photographs in Wright's archive. The Historical Society had acquired Wright's entire collection in 1923 after his death, but it had never been properly cataloged. Dozens of portraits showed the same hand-positioning system families, photographed between 1890 and 1896. Each image was carefully numbered, each one documenting people who had been systematically excluded from official records. They identified other members of the network. A teacher named Samuel Brooks helped families obtain school records for their children. A clerk in the city property office named Mary Chen processed deeds and ensured paperwork was properly filed. A minister, Reverend James Washington, performed marriages and provided certificates when official channels refused. Each person had taken quiet risks, using their position to help others while operating within systems designed to exclude the very people they served. Together, it created something powerful, a shadow archive that preserved dignity and protection, when official America offered neither. 3 months into their research, James and Sarah organized an exhibition at the Historical Society. They displayed 20 portraits from Wright's collection, each showing the hand-positioning system, each accompanied by the story they had uncovered about the family photographed. Patricia Johnson attended, seeing her great-grandmother's portrait properly honored for the first time. She brought her daughter and granddaughter for generations of Laner Morrison's descendants standing before the image that had started everything. The exhibition's most powerful moments came when other descendants arrived. James and Sarah had located families connected to 12 of the photographed individuals. Each brought fragments of the story oral histories, old letters, faded documents that suddenly made sense within the context of the network. An elderly man named Thomas Hayes stood before a portrait of his great-grandfather. The lawyer Robert Hayes, photographed with his hands positioned in the same deliberate code. "I always heard he helped people," Thomas said quietly, "but I never knew the extent. I never knew he was part of something this organized." A woman named Grace Brooks examined a portrait of Samuel Brooks, the teacher. "My family said he was arrested once in 1895 for helping a family obtain false documents, but the charges were dropped. Looking at this now, I don't think the documents were false. I think he was helping people get the documentation they deserved, but were denied." The New York Times covered the exhibition. The article ran with the headline, "Hidden in Plain Sight: How Post-Reconstruction Activists Built a Secret Documentation Network." Within days, historians from across the country contacted James, sharing similar discoveries from their own region's parallel networks in Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago, all operating during the same period, all using subtle codes and photographs to document and protect African American families navigating hostile systems. 6 months after discovering the portrait, James stood in the Historical Society's conservation lab, carefully handling the glass plate negative. Dozens of Wright's photographs had been digitally restored, each image now preserved and accessible to descendants and researchers. The portrait of the mother and daughters had become iconic, reproduced in textbooks, featured in documentaries, and displayed in museums. Yet for James, its meaning remained deeply personal. He thought of Eleanor Morrison, born enslaved, who had built a life of dignity and purpose in New York. She had helped countless families navigate systems designed to exclude them. She had posed for this photograph with her daughters, their hands carefully arranged in a code meant to preserve their place in history. Patricia Johnson later donated Elana's personal papers to the Historical Society letters, a diary and business records from her work as a seamstress. In the diary, Elana wrote about the photograph. Had our portrait made today. Mr. Wright is a kind man, understands what we are building. The girls were nervous, but I told them this picture will matter. Someday people will see what we did here. She had been right. The photograph had mattered. It preserved not only their likenesses, but evidence of their resistance, ingenuity, and refusal to be erased. Sarah traced 63 families through the network, documenting how they obtained property deeds, legal marriages, business licenses, and school records fundamental rights that should have been automatic, but instead required elaborate workarounds. The network had operated from roughly 1888 to 1897, helping hundreds of families before gradually dissolving as some activists died, others moved away, and new systems emerged. Thomas Wright died in 1923, his contributions largely forgotten. Robert Hayes practiced law until 1910. Ella Laner Morrison lived to see her daughters married and established, and her work carried forward by others. The network did not end systemic injustice, but it provided practical help to people who desperately needed it. James now met regularly with descendants, collecting oral histories and connecting families who shared this hidden heritage. The portrait had become more than historical evidence. It was a bridge between generations, a testament that their ancestors had been resourceful, connected, and determined to create justice when official America denied it. He thought again of Eleanor's hands. Deliberately positioned in that Brooklyn studio in 1892, her fingers forming a code that would outlive her and carry her story across more than a century. In the end, the simplest gestures could hold the most profound truths. Sometimes you only needed to look closely enough to see.